Oh, Justin T, you're a sight to see, strutting in socks as bright as can be, with maple leaves and rainbow hues, a fashion statement we didn't choose. You flash that smile, you strike a pose like the star of Canada's reality shows. But while you're busy playing the part, who's steering the moose-drawn cart? Oh, Justin, fancy socks Trudeau, what's your next scandal? We all wanna know. From lockdowns to truckers, you sure made a scene, but your selfies, man, they're squeaky clean. You told us to stay home, keep the door shut tight, while your photo ops lit up the night. Flatten the curve was your famous refrain, but your poll numbers never felt the pain. Then came the truckers with horns that blare. You met them with cops like you just don't care. You froze their funds, you called them names, but Justin, aren't you the king of the blame games? Oh, Justin, fancy socks Trudeau, what's your next scandal? We all wanna know. From lockdowns to truckers, you sure made a scene, but your selfies, man, they're squeaky clean. Ethics breaches, oh, who's keeping score? Your charity scandals leave us wanting more. With every stumble you manage to spin, dancing around like you're destined to win. A master of drama, you cry on cue. A one-man Broadway, it's all about you. From blackface blunders to AgaCon trips, your legacy's packed with comedic scripts. But hey, at least your socks are bold, a distraction tactic that never gets old. So here's to you, our selfie king, the Bard of Ottawa, let freedom ring. Oh, Justin, fancy socks Trudeau, what's your next scandal? We all wanna know. From lockdowns to truckers, you sure made a scene, but your selfies, man, they're squeaky clean. So let's raise a toast to the man with flair, with his socks and his scandals and his well-coiffed hair. Justin Trudeau, you're a comedy gold, a tale for the ages, forever retold.
Greetings, Mavericks and new viewers. Tonight, direct and live from the Maverick News Network World Studios. This is Maverick News with Rick Walker.
Welcome back to the Maverick News Channel, everyone. Special broadcast tonight. We're going to talk about Ukraine, but before we get into that, I will highlight today's top news stories. Of course, today, the memory of former President Jimmy Carter being honored at the Washington National Cathedral. All living U.S. presidents have been in attendance there, including President-elect Donald Trump, paying respects to a man celebrated for his humanitarian efforts and leadership. Carter, who passed away at the age of 100, will be remembered for his Nobel Peace Prize work and his post-presidency contributions to global health and peace. Now, out in California, devastating wildfires continue to rage through parts of Los Angeles, claiming at least 5 lives so far. The response has been massive, with thousands of resources deployed to contain the blazes that have displaced over 100,000 residents. The fires have sparked discussions about emergency preparedness and climate change, with many areas now looking like scorched earth. President Biden saying no expense will be spared, vowing to support rebuilding efforts. But of course, he's on his way out. Trump is on his way in, and we'll have to see what happens in the long run. Now, in a move that's shaking Canadian politics, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced his resignation, of course, just days ago. And then today, on an interview with CNN, he talked about the tensions between the U.S. and Canada, especially with Trump talking about Canada becoming the 51st state, and then also clarified again that there's not a snowball's chance in hell of Canada actually joining the U.S. We'll see how that goes. Speaking of Trump, he's back in the headlines with his persistent push for territorial expansion now. And he's not ruling out using military force to gain control over Greenland and the Panama Canal, suggesting that both are crucial for U.S. national security. And his proposal is leading to international backlash, with Denmark and Greenland firmly rejecting the idea. Although, with Donald Trump Jr. visiting over there and Charlie Kirk both saying that they have spoken to Greenland residents who claim that they're treated terribly by the government over there, and they're eager to join. He says residents are eager to join the United States. We'll again have to wait and see. On the international front, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine still sees no immediate end, and Ukraine reports significant Russian losses, including an entire battalion, as the war continues to strain global relations. And the focus remains on diplomatic efforts, with the U.S. committing at least now another $500 million for support to Ukraine, underscoring the commitment to backing Kyiv in this protracted conflict. And tonight, Jeff Evely will be joining us again for an encore appearance. He was on just the other night, and we were discussing just on the periphery Ukraine, but I didn't really want to get into it that night because it's a complex issue, and I want to share information tonight with all of you that maybe you're not seeing everywhere. So it's not so much, I don't think, a debate that we're going to have tonight, Jeff and I, but we are going to have a discussion and explore the information and the issues surrounding the Ukraine conflict and the Ukraine issue in general. I think we have kind of somewhat different views on this, and maybe together we can come together on some of these points and find some common ground, and who knows, maybe even take a tiny little step toward promoting peace right here on the Maverick News channel. So stay with me, because we will welcome Jeff back to the program on the other side of this.
Greetings, brave Mavericks. Our quest for truth continues. We go beyond fake news. Together we expose propaganda. Together we pull others out of rabbit holes. We are maverick thinkers. We are all unique individuals, defenders of individual rights and freedoms, credible, trusted, grounded in reality. Maverick News, Maverick News. Defending free speech, free speech. Donate at freedomreporters.com. Do it now. Tomorrow may be too late. Maverick News. The world is watching.
All right, let's bring Jeff back in. Hello, sir. Welcome back.
Hey, Rick. Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for coming back. Everybody loves you here. Oh. I got to tell you.
It's unusual.
Yeah. Like everybody's like, yeah, he's a great guest. And just tons of positive feedback from the last program. So I appreciate you coming back and joining us again.
I'm feeling the love. Thanks, everybody.
Now, the other night we were talking about a lot of things, and Ukraine came up. And you know, my views on Ukraine have really changed a lot over the last couple of years. And I think, 2 years ago, or almost 3 years ago now, as the special military operation began, I was more in alignment with what your views are, I think. And now I'm kind of way over here on the other side. So to begin the discussion, I kind of thought I'd throw it over to you just to kind of get my bearings on where you're at with it, and then we can explore, the different information and some of the stuff that maybe you haven't heard of on my side.
Yeah, sounds great. And I am looking forward to this debate. It shouldn't be a dirty word. We're the only ones who do it in the West. That's what makes it so great to begin with. All of the ancients, actually, like the classics, the ancient philosophers of Athens, would write in dialogue, right? They would actually like script out these debates and stuff like that. A lot of them were fictional, but we recognizing the value in that, I think, is what made it so great in the first place. So, and like you said, like it'll improve our each of our understandings, I'm sure, and the audience as well. So shouldn't be a dirty word, but I'm looking forward to kicking your ass. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, straight up, I'll be, bottom line up front. I kind of stopped following the war. I mean, I do, but it hasn't really been a focal point for me in the last little while, just because I just sort of wrote it off. And I said, it's corrupt. I get it. So I just kind of wrote it off a while back, I guess. But my position, I guess, is basically, well, first of all, it shouldn't have happened, and it wouldn't have happened under a second Donald Trump presidency. And also, it does appear to be the case that was all central to one of the impeachments of Donald Trump, because that was the one where he had the perfect phone call with Zelensky. And he was sniffing out what the Bidens were up to over there, with Hunter being on the board of Burisma while he was doing hookers and blow everywhere. And Joe Biden taking that $5 million forgivable interest-free loan from a Chinese oligarch, while Hunter was apparently running money laundering for him through Burisma, for Chinese oligarchs. And Victoria Nuland was the one who selected Zelensky to be the president. I think it was probably Klitschko who was the favorite amongst the people, and the decision was made by Victoria Nuland to sideline Klitschko in favor of Zelensky, who we all know is an actor. And the geostrategically, I think it's just disastrous, because the strategy since the end of the Vietnam War, since the boomers chickened out of Vietnam, we can't, like, we have China and Russia, who historically have been adversarial, and they're both communists, both have aspirations of global dominance. We were already in a Cold War with Russia, like since the end of the Second World War. And we were trying to contain China with Korea, where General McAllister said we should have bombed them directly. And because they did drive the Americans out of North Korea. That's how we got to North Korea. And also in Vietnam, because of the pullout from Vietnam that precipitated 2 genocides in Asia, they now have access to the Golden Triangle and therefore opium dominance. And that's why we're being flooded with opioids right now. And with the Ukraine war, as I guess unintended consequence, what they've done is exactly what Nixon and every president since him has been trying to avoid, which is to drive that Russian bear into the 10,000 talons of that Chinese dragon, so that they ally against the West. And now we have the world's largest gas supply right next to the world's largest population, 2 of the world's most powerful militaries, both of them nuclear. They have a military alliance, and they're forming a currency, or I guess, they probably have aspirations of that. But I think Trump is stamping that down a bit. So it's just a disaster to let it happen in the first place. It looks like all the people not all the people, but definitely the Bidens, the ones in the key decision-making positions on this.
Just to let you know, your microphone, your audio is kind of cut out. It's like it might be better now.
Okay.
There it is. It's back. Okay.
All right. I don't know what happens when I come in your studio. My mic just does something weird. But I think, that's about my position, I guess, Rick. It's just that it never should have happened. It's because of weak and or corrupt leadership. Now, that's not to say the 2 things can't be true at once. It could also be the case, and I believe it is also the case, that Russia its whole history is one of Russia trying to get to the sea because everything's frozen in Russia, and they don't really have access to the Mediterranean. We control their access by making Turkey a NATO ally. That's the only reason those assholes are in there, is to keep Russia out of the Mediterranean. And there's also the Black Sea. Like if they get access to that, then that's easy access to the It's tidewater, which they don't really have in Russia. So, and we always want, they're belligerent. So we don't want them in our waters because it's going to be trouble for us. And all kinds of stuff happens when there's trouble for us. We can see that with, with what's going on in Yemen and the Houthis, and cargo shipping prices have doubled because most of the ships are having to go around the South Africa just to get over to Europe instead of going through the Suez Canal. So, I think we would run into that kind of trouble if Russia ever had unfettered access to the sea that we do. Two things can be true at the same time. Russia does need to be contained. I believe that, but I don't believe that this war should be happening. And I think geostrategically, like I said, it's going to end up serving the interests of the global totalitarians in the end, because of these alliances that are forming and depletion of NATO ammunition and funding.
Okay, so let's kind of take it piece by piece here, I guess. And the first thing is that you see this as, and this is the narrative that is, I think, most popular right now, is that this is the result of NATO expansionism, which then Russia sees as an existential threat. And that's why we have the conflict. So it's actually NATO's fault that Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yes. I'll go with that. I'll throw one little thought in there. Sure. I recognize that just the way you stated it like that has all the hallmarks of a communist narrative.
which, by the way, Donald Trump repeated almost syllable for syllable, I think just yesterday, right?
Yes, he did.
So alarming, but okay, yeah.
Well, that's also diplomatic.
Possibly.
Once in a while, he'll throw in a little point there. He'll take a page out of like Vladimir Putin's playbook, and he'll just say something that's about flattery and schmoozing, because that's what he is. He's a salesman, so he might just be schmoozing Putin there. I'm not concerned about the Russia hoax when it comes to Donald Trump. But
okay, so but you subscribe to the idea that this is really our fault or NATO's fault.
I mean, as I said, I think if Trump were in office, it wouldn't have happened. So, in that sense, yeah, I guess you could say it's our fault. It's NATO's fault.
Okay.
I take a more nuanced view on the issues, as you can see.
Yeah, and that's okay. You see, because I think the whole NATO narrative is an excuse, and it's kind of a lie, because the justification or the reasons for being concerned about NATO expansionism ultimately just don't hold water. And Putin and Russia, the narrative is that the United States, NATO, promised after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War in the 90s that NATO would not expand one further inch east. But it's a lie. It's not actually true. And to make that point, no such promise was ever actually made. They cite some memorandums or a memo that from some of the discussions where James Baker alludes to not putting any more troops into Germany and not putting troops in Germany. But there was never any guarantee, no promise even, to not expand NATO. And with that said, I would challenge anyone to produce a document, a treaty, signed. Tell me what the date is. Tell me where it is, because it doesn't exist. There is no treaty or signed agreement of any kind that promises that NATO won't expand toward Russia at any point. It just simply doesn't exist. And I'll even go further than that, but I'll let you comment.
Yeah, I thought that the claim Putin was making was that it was a verbal agreement, and you're talking about like, no, I'm not taking the word of a tyrant. It seems like a reasonable enough of a claim, but at the same time, like even when I heard him saying that and said, okay, so there's no evidence to support this, but even as I heard him say that, I was like, well, that doesn't mean that we should expand right up to his doorstep and expect that he's not going to get bent out of shape out of that. I would expect him to get bent out of shape out of that. So there's no agreement, but we still did it, you know.
Except that there are other agreements in place that address this very issue in a way that shows that Russia is being disingenuous here.
Oh, I believe that.
Yeah. And so, for instance, there is the North Atlantic, the NATO-Russia founding treaty. And this was signed in the 90s after, I think 1997. The Founding Act signed by NATO and Russia. And this very document says that Russia, that NATO, that any country has the sovereign right to join NATO, or they can also join a defense pact with Russia if they so choose. Either side. Countries can join either way, and they will respect that. And I can even show you the document. It's right here, which is in contradiction to the assertion that there was this promise made that there would be no NATO expansionism. And so it's right here. And there is actually a quote that I've got up here too from the document, if I can find it. I've got a lot of tabs here tonight because I didn't want to just come on here and be a windbag. I want to actually back this up with real evidence, right?
It's good. It's good stuff. Yeah.
I
guess I would still kind of go back to what I said before. Like, that doesn't mean it's a good idea.
Well, except that it's not the threat that that Russia is making it out to be. And the reason I say that is because here it is right here. The NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997. And you see, the whole purpose of this is to allow countries to join a defense pact on either side, if they so choose, but it's a defensive agreement. And even with NATO, they did not put offensive weapons into any of the countries that have joined NATO that are closer and closer to Russia. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, they didn't do any of that until after Russia went into Crimea, taking part of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And even now, even as you look at like Poland, where they have just installed new missile defense systems, those systems are actually defensive. They are all designed to shoot incoming missiles down. They're not missiles that they aim at Russia. So there's a big difference. Even with that, though, Russia is spinning up the claims that NATO is taking an aggressive stance toward them and that they are threatening them by putting these missile defense systems in there, and because they say they could be modified in the future to be offensive weapons, but they're defensive in case of missile attacks from Russia. So all these countries are actually in defensive posture, and as long as Russia doesn't attack them, then it doesn't trigger any of the NATO provisions like Article 5, where NATO would then be at war with Russia. But if Russia does attack, then they've got a problem on their hands. So this is why the claim is disingenuous. It just is.
I believe all that.
Yeah.
And watch the Tucker Carlson interview. Vladimir Putin is a very smooth operator, and he lies with ease and frequency. And I think he kind of charmed the pants off of Tucker. I was surprised at how easy Tucker made it for him, but yeah, he's very cagey. He's very slick, and I mean, he's Russian. Like, these guys lie as a matter of course. Sorry, Russia. So not talking about like Cat Canada or anybody like that, but I just mean like the Kremlin. This is how they operate, and 80% of it is psychological, right? That's what Yuri Bezmenov said.
Massive Russian information campaign over here, advertising, propaganda, call it what you want. But here's the Russia Founding Act of 1997. Here's one of the quotes from the actual signed document: respect for sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states and their inherent right to choose the means to ensure their own security, the inviolability of borders and people's right of self-determination, and enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act and other OSCE documents. This document says that any country, any sovereign nation, has the right to defend itself, to decide how it's going to defend itself, and can join. That means they can join NATO if they want to. It's a NATO document. There's nothing in there from either side saying that either side can't expand either way.
I just think that it's still like geostrategically and geopolitically, it's a blunder to bring Ukraine into NATO. I mean, the history on this is one of missiles in Turkey that resulted in missiles in Cuba and almost World War III under Kennedy. That was Turkey.
Except, Jeff, that this is not that scenario. Because first of all, Ukraine gave up its missiles at the end of the Cold War. When at the end of the Cold War, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet within its borders. They could have repurposed those and taken control of them, and they would have been a nuclear power unto themselves. But in the interests of peace, they gave up all of those. There was another document also signed by the UK, United States, and Ukraine, the Budapest Memorandum.
And it's in that same spirit that I would advise Ukraine that they should probably just stay out of NATO.
Except that the problem is, Jeff, that they weren't in NATO. There was no specific date for them to join NATO. And Vladimir Putin rattled his sabers and took Crimea and Donbass. And again, being very disingenuous, and I'm going to show you tonight that it was Vladimir Putin and Russia that started this entire conflict, that it was not NATO expansionism that posed an existential threat to Russia. It's the other way around. It's Russia that poses the existential threat to the smaller nation, sovereign nation state of Ukraine, because Vladimir Putin does not recognize even the existence of Ukraine as a nation state, and just decided that he was going to take it back. Although it is a distinct society and it has a distinct culture, and that's why it is truly an existential threat to Ukraine. Russia is the existential threat to Ukraine, and I'll illustrate that for you, but I'll throw it back to you.
No, I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing all this. I've always been suspicious, I guess, not very, secure in my position about what's going on. I said from the day one, I was like, it's really hard to tell what's happening with this particular conflict. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm interested to know about the bio labs in Ukraine, because it seems like both sides admitted that. I mean, fire away, man. Looking forward to it.
So with regard to, we can get into the biolabs later if you really want to. But with regard to the existential threat to Ukraine, Ukraine never threatened at any point Russia. They never said we're going to invade you. It would be insane for them to do it. They didn't have the firepower. They didn't have they didn't have the weapons. And in fact, the Russian narrative is double-edged and in contradiction to itself, because on the one hand, we keep being told that Russia is this giant superpower. Don't even try. We might as well give up now, because there's no way that Ukraine can win. There's no way the West can win. They're so powerful that we don't stand a chance against them anyway. On the other hand, we're being told that Ukraine, which didn't possess enough weapons at the, when all of this started, and it started far before the full scale invasion that Putin calls the special military operation. It started long before that. Ukraine didn't have the weapons. They didn't even have Javelin missiles that Trump eventually gave them in his first presidency back in 2016. They didn't even have those to defend themselves against tanks that Russia actually finally started to bring in. Because I put it to you that Russia actually generated, fueled, and even created an internal conflict, a civil war within Russia itself, in order to destabilize the country and create the conditions to justify their special military operation and their expansionist, imperialist ambitions.
What about the shelling of the Donbass?
That is the result of exactly what I'm talking about right now. You have to understand that the Russian-speaking population, the portions where you've got heavy Russian-speaking populations further in the east, those people, a lot of them are the product of the Soviet era, where Stalin brought in more Russian-speaking people. In some cases, there was even forced migration during the Stalin era, because Stalin needed to fuel or monetize and capitalize his industrial revolution in order to compete with Western powers at the time. He needed Ukraine because he didn't have enough capital to industrialize his nation. So he did that with Ukrainian grain and other Ukrainian resources, and he basically went in there and confiscated the grain from Ukrainian farmers. That's part of what led to the Holodomor, which is between 1932 and 1933, which resulted in mass starvation in parts of Ukraine. And when that happened, Stalin actually moved in even more Russian-speaking people in order to provide labor to continue to generate economic output, so that he could then convert the grain into capital to industrialize the country, to generate to create tractors, to mechanize agriculture, to build infrastructure, to build even arms, tanks, arm the country as they moved into the industrial era. Without Ukraine, they didn't have any capital and nothing to convert into capital to industrialize the country, so he needed it. And it was through heavy, unfair taxation against the kulaks in Ukraine. It was Ukraine that funded, essentially, largely, the economic expansion and industrialization of Russia. And Stalin did it on the backs of the people. This is one of the reasons Ukraine doesn't want to live under Russian rule. They still remember those times and the oppressive life that they lived under Stalin. So where am I going with this? I've kind of lost where I'm supposed to head off with this. What was it you wanted to know?
I was asking about the shelling of the Donbass.
Oh, the shelling of the Donbass. Okay, so you've got the Russian-speaking population up there. Culture is one of the things that really kind of has been used to drive a wedge in between the people of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin accuses the United States of staging a coup, and you alluded to the phone call, the leaked phone call between Victoria Nuland and Victor Payet. which actually doesn't prove a darn thing. It's really them talking about the U.S. sales pitch, essentially, and the not even the U.S. but the European Union's sales pitch that was being made to Ukraine at the time, because Ukraine was at a crossroads economically. They were in a financial crisis, and they needed basically a bailout. And the people were trying to decide if they were going to go with the European Union more and do more trade with the European Union, or with the or strengthen ties with Russia. Both sides were there at the time, kind of pitching Ukraine. Russia was there pitching the politicians of Ukraine, offering a $15 billion bailout. The European Union only came in with about 600 million at the time, with conditions. But the people of Ukraine, in spite of the big difference in the amounts of money, the people still were putting pressure on and voted for integration with the EU. The reason for that is, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the standard of living in places like Poland, which had been integrated into the EU, were substantially higher than in Ukraine. For instance, wages on average were 3 times higher for countries that had ties to the European Union versus what the people in Ukraine were living on, because they had such economic hardship there at the time. And actually, you weren't quite exactly right. It wasn't, see, this is the thing about this whole Nuland phone call. Victoria Nuland did not pick Vladimir Zelensky as the president of Ukraine. In fact, what that phone call was about was they were talking about Klitschko, who's like an athlete. They wanted him involved because he was like a public figure and was also working to kind of keep the peace at the time. He didn't end up getting the position, but they were talking about who might fill the position of president, and it was only an interim president that was selected at that time, as the EU and the United States were both involved in kind of pitching the EU position to the Ukrainian government. And it wasn't even Zelensky that came after that. It was Poroshenko, who later was elected as the president of Ukraine after that. That's the guy that Russia actually tried to poison and kill. Yeah. They didn't like him. And so it was him that came afterward. And then Zelensky came after Poroshenko.
It wasn't Victoria Nuland asking for Zelensky on the phone?
No, Zelensky was talking to Pyatt, and what they all they were really doing is they were talking about, how are we going to pitch this? What are we going to do when we basically make our presentation to the Ukrainian government, to these parliamentarians, right? What are we going to do? Well, how are we going to pitch
as an interim president? You mean?
What's that?
Who are we going to put forward as an interim president? Is that what you're saying?
Who they're saying who of course they want to, that they're talking about who they might like and who would they like to. There's nothing in that conversation. I could pull it up and we could analyze it if you wanted to. The first time I heard it, I thought like you. I was like, oh, there they are. They're talking about who they're going to install as the next president of Ukraine, their puppet. But it's actually, again, the other way around, Jeff, because it was Yanukovych who was the current president at that time. And in fact, Nuland and Pyatt were talking about trying to get Yanukovych to do what they wanted him to do, or not get him to do what they wanted him to do, but to convince him to follow through on his promise to sign off on more European integration, on the EU deal. Yanukovych was still in power, and Yanukovych was not pro-Western. Yanukovych was Putin's boy. Yanukovych was a puppet of Putin. He was put into power by Putin. But Yanukovych, that's why, even though they had a deal with the EU, because the people wanted it, Yanukovych went back on his promise to the people, didn't sign it, and that's what kicked off the whole Maidan protest and uprising that resulted in violent kickback from the Ukrainian government under Yanukovych, where they actually shot protesters a lot of them. It turned into a war zone. And then after all that happened, it was Yanukovych, who could have stayed on as president had he just signed the document the way that the people wanted him to and the way he had promised, but he didn't do it because he had a phone call with Putin. We don't know exactly what was said in that phone call, but Putin was, adamantly opposed to Ukraine joining the EU. And Yanukovych ended up fleeing the country. He jumped on a helicopter and hightailed it out of there after having the troops shoot the protesters. In addition to that, Burisma, that's another red herring and a distortion of the actual facts, because Burisma, yeah, it's a problem. And yeah, that is a representation of corruption. And yes, Hunter Biden, the optics on that, terrible. And so they should be, because something was really stinky there. But the founder of Burisma was joined at the hip to Yanukovych. Burisma was essentially a oil and gas company that was working very much in tandem with Russian interests. And so here you have the son of the president of the United States who gets hooked up with this oil and gas company that on the surface it's Ukrainian. Not really. It's an international company doing business in places like Germany, Mexico, a lot of different countries around the world, and especially in Ukraine. But it's this guy's like hand in hand working with Yanukovych, who is Putin's boy. He's Putin's plant. And so after all of this goes down and Hunter Biden gets this plum position on the board of Burisma, which is clearly not working above board because there's so much corruption in Ukraine at the time. You have to understand that a lot of these oligarchs, and that's what a lot of this is about, but the oligarchs who are profiting from Ukraine and owned so much of Ukraine were oligarchs who were installed or created even after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they had ties back to Russia. There was a ton of Russian corruption inside the Ukrainian government because they had such long-standing ties with the former Soviet Union.
Okay. So Hunter is working with a Russian, but it's still like, how did he get there? What's with the Chinese and the $5 million loan to, it's a bribe to Biden himself.
Well, the Chinese loan, that's something separate and apart from, specifically what's going on in Ukraine. And what I'm not saying that, but you've got basically a president and a son who Biden was sent. See, this is the thing. Biden was sent there by Obama to clean up corruption in Ukraine because that was one of the conditions of the EU deal. The Ukrainian government was required to address issues of corruption or it was no deal. So Biden goes there, but then he goes there and puts his hand in the cookie jar, gets his son a plum position on the board of Burisma, doing basically nothing, which they were trying to bolster the credibility of the company by putting a number of high-profile people, including Hunter Biden, on there. But it really backfired because the Russians just grabbed a hold of that and turned it into a PR nightmare, not only for Biden, which was deserved, but also for Ukraine. And for Burisma, which, by the way, was under investigation. The Ukrainian government, as part of the effort to address issues of corruption, the Ukrainian government began to investigate it, and then Biden stopped it. He said, no, you're not going to investigate this, and if you don't fire the investigator, that we've seen the clip, right? But that's not because the Ukrainian government didn't want to do it. It's because Joe Biden didn't want to do it. And I would also argue that even though, Biden has sent a lot of money and a lot of arms over there, but if you've seen the way that he's been doing it, he's been trickling it out. They've never given them enough to win, only enough to kind of keep the war going and keep Russia from winning. There's some various reasons on that, and I can get into that too, but that doesn't justify what Russia has done. And I would argue that what Russia did is not only immoral, it's illegal, and they've lied about the whole thing from the very beginning. Now, you want to talk about the shelling in the Donbass? That is because Russia started a civil war. The narrative has been, and I never really fully understood this at the beginning. Sure, yeah.
Before you go back to that, I just to plant a flag in the thing is, what's Joe Biden getting paid to do by the Chinese? So like, and he's behaving in a way, and this is just from the outside. He's behaving in a way that I would say is very advantageous to the Chinese, because now they have this alliance with the Russians, and it benefits them in the end. Like the winners here, above all, Russia's been decimated. I think they lost 2/3 of their military, and Ukraine. Like I can't praise the war effort exactly. Just looking at the way they're recruiting right now, with their brutal conscriptions. But so yeah, that's still kind of my suspicion, is that I'm still wondering. I can accept that this is Russian initiated. I kind of always suspected that it was. Like I said, it's really hard to tell, and they lie so much.
And keep in mind that the war was not ongoing when Biden was involved in all this corruption, right? That hadn't, the full-scale invasion hadn't started yet. This is long before that. This is when Obama was in power.
Yeah. This is from 2014. Is when it really kind of kicked off. But
actually, I'll say before that, but you go ahead.
Okay. I'm interested to hear that too. But yeah, I guess that now that just leaves the question. I can accept that this is by and large being instigated by the Russians, and there's a lot of disinformation out there because they do that, and I see it elsewhere, especially around the conflict in the Middle East. It's a lot of Russian disinfo. Even like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was originally Tsarist secret police.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of disinformation around it. I understand that, and they can really be doing all of those things that I was talking about before, with access to the Black Sea and Tidewater, and that could be a motivating factor. I think it would have been contained under Donald Trump. It would have been contained, and it still leaves the question of what is Biden being bribed to do in Ukraine.
Well, if that's what the Chinese money was for, and I don't know. I mean, they didn't call me up and say that we're bribing Joe Biden with this money to do X. I don't know what the money is for. We can only judge him by his actions, I guess. But the the whole thing though did not really start in 2014.
Okay.
It started before that. This is what I'm getting at. This is like Russia always, under Putin, creates the conditions so that they can portray themselves as victims, as the victim of an aggression, that they're on the receiving end of everything. And that's exactly what was going on in Ukraine. Part of their we need to go back a little bit further. This goes back to like 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. And you know what? What I'm going to do, because he's probably more eloquent than I am, the Lex Friedman interview with Zelensky this week, I found him to be fairly balanced in his approach. And at the beginning of his interview, he actually gives a summary of the timeline. So maybe we should begin with that, because he actually is picking things up in 1991 with this in a very short clip that will help sum this up, and then it'll segue into what we need to talk about next.
Now, finally, please allow me to briefly overview some history to give background for several topics that President Zelensky references in this conversation. I recommend my conversation with Serhiy Plohi and many others about the history of the region. But here, let me start with 1991, when Ukraine declared its independence and the Soviet Union collapsed. From this point on, Russia-Ukraine relations were defined in large part by whether Ukraine aligned more with Russia or with the West, meaning Europe, United States, NATO, and so on. In 2004, with the Orange Revolution, a pro-Western candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, became president. In 2010, it went the other way. A pro-Russia candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, became president. The internal tensions grew, and in 2013, Euromaidan protests broke out over Yanukovych's decision to suspend talks with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. This set forward a chain of important events in 2014. On the politics front, Yanukovych was ousted and fled to Russia, leading to the election of a pro-Western president. Also, in 2014, on the war front, Russia annexed Crimea and war broke out in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, which eventually killed over 14,000 people and continued all the way to 2022, when, on February 24th, 2022, Russian forces initiated a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is when the world started to really pay attention. Now, some history of peace talks.
Okay, we'll just stop there for a moment. You asked about the shelling in the Donbass. It's because there was this war. Back when the full-scale invasion was just beginning, the narrative coming from Russia, which really was dominating over here, was it was Ukraine shelling its own people for no reason. That's what was continually being told. That's what was being spun up. It never really made sense to me. I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. In reality, this conflict had been going on for quite some time, well in advance of all of this. And it's because you had a separatist movement, which we can relate to here in Canada, because we've got separatist movements right here. Or if you want to talk about, Ireland or other countries, they're separatists. So Russia went in and they armed these separatists a long time ago. They gave them weapons, and they even sent in their own soldiers. They called them little green men. And that's because they were Russian soldiers with no insignia. And Russia denied and denied and denied that they were ever there. They denied that they were involved in any way. And it went on, and it festered and festered and festered. And Ukraine responded, of course, because it was a separatist movement violently opposing the government and trying to overthrow it with Russian supplied weapons and actually Russian troops who now were being told, they've even admitted it, and they've even put the separatists on Russian military pensions, some of these guys who were fighting back then. And there was plenty of proof coming up, but the world really was not paying attention at that time. It just wasn't on anybody's radar. And there's a ton of evidence to support this. And while Russia was saying, oh no, we're not involved in this conflict in Ukraine, we're not involved at all. Well, they sure as hell were. They were providing arms, weapons, and they kept escalating and sending in troops. And this is work that was done by, what do they call this? This is the Forensic Architecture Organization. They're basically an independent research firm, and they used a variety of techniques over those years to document Russian activity and involvement in the war. They used artificial intelligence, they used machine learning to identify and geolocate troops, armaments, vehicles that are only used by Russian forces inside Ukraine during this time period before the full-scale invasion, involved in what is essentially a civil war that Russia really created the conditions for. They basically created the civil war by sending in separatists in order to destabilize everything. And you can see
following the battle on September 3rd,
right here.
a convoy of military
Sorry.
vehicles can be seen 10 kilometers south of Ilovaisk.
Aerial satellite
It
photography.
includes armored vehicles and flatbed trucks.
And of course,
A few
Russia
kilometers
says they're
away,
not there.
More vehicles are visible. Dust clouds suggest that they are heading east towards Russia. Open source investigators found more vehicles and military camps on either side of the border around that time. On the Russian side of the border, images from the 28th of August show a convoy coming from the direction of Ukraine. The vehicles have no visible insignia apart from these white circles. To verify what these markings meant, we set out to find further evidence of military vehicles within Ukraine. Doing so meant searching through hundreds of hours of video footage. To speed up the process, we used machine learning to help us find the most relevant videos. A machine learning classifier analyzes videos frame by frame and returns a probability that each video it analyzes contains what we've trained it to look for, in this case, military vehicles. We noticed tanks recurring in the results, so we refined the classifier to focus on them. We developed a user interface to interpret and navigate the results. Sections highlighted in red indicate where the classifier has predicted the presence of a tank.
Well, this can go on for a while. There's so much of this evidence, and it was submitted to international courts and accepted as being credible enough to be considered actual evidence. So, and this is not like this is not CIA. This is independent, and there's just reams of it. In addition to that, there's a Russian intelligence officer, Igor, let me find the clip of him. Yeah, this is Igor Gherkin. And this is him on a television show after the fact, admitting that he was in there commanding troops at the time. Let me show you. Admitting it. And he did so on more than one occasion. This isn't even, I wouldn't say, the clearest confession of them all, but he does assert this.
Николай, вы в Крыму...
Were you in Crimea? He says, I was there on the 16th March for the
Я там был
referendum.
16 марта на референдуме. Пожалуйста.
Well, pardon me, I was in Crimea from the 21st of February, 6 days before Russia invaded, and you know what you're telling me is absolute bullshit, blah, blah, blah. Furthermore, unfortunately, I didn't see any support from any organ of government power.
Органов государственной власти в Симферополе, где я конкретно находился.
He says, where I was located, I didn't see the support. It wasn't there, this other guy. The Crimean deputies were rounded up, our militias, in order to corral them to the hall and make them vote for the decision to secede from Ukraine. He's talking about actually being there. And you can find other documentation where he talks about actually being there commanding troops. Russia, in response over time, because this has come out and exposed what was going on, they're trying to peddle it as though the soldiers there were volunteers. So justifying it that way, right? So
no, I remember the little green men. Yeah,
Yep,
they're
yep.
they're shady as fuck.
yeah.
Absolutely. Like I'm not the guy making the case that the Russians are good guys. They're not. They're bad guys.
I'm just trying to illustrate here that this idea that NATO went in there and poked the bear, and so you got a response from a provocation. It's the other way around. Russia was pushing in there and creating the conditions so that when they did go in, they could spin up this narrative where they're saying, see, we were just defending the Russian-speaking population from the Ukrainian government that was shelling them only because they speak Russian. There's really no reason otherwise. It's just no real reason. It's just because they speak Russian. They hate the Russians. They hate Russians. And we have to denazify the country. All these Ukrainians who are screwed up in the head because they're nationalists and they say they want their own nation state and independence. They're crazy. They've always been part of Russia. What are they talking about? They're insane. They're Nazis, you see. So we have to denazify the country because they're They're just shelling their Russian-speaking citizens for no reason other than the fact that they don't want them speaking Russian. And that wasn't the case
we
at
did
all.
give a standing ovation to a Nazi in our parliament.
Well,
What about Azov Battalion?
Azov Battalion?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that you've got people with insignias, and there are definitely neo-Nazis in Ukraine. There's no question about that. And we've addressed that even on the program with some of the people here who have defended, the Ukrainian position. But I would say that it's not as cut and dried and as simple as that, because right now, and I've illustrated this on the program before, Russia has more neo-Nazis fighting in its army than Ukraine has fighting in its.
Of course it does.
Of course it does. And in addition to that, people keep saying Russia's not a threat because it's not the Soviet Union anymore. And it's not a threat to the US at all, or to NATO. They would just be benign if we would just leave them alone. And in fact, I'm going to say to you tonight that the opposite is actually true. You can find the aggressive agenda in the writings of Vladimir Putin himself, and certainly in the work of philosopher Alexander Dugin, who is considered by some to be Putin's brain. He is the architect of much of this, and he goes back into history, and he has created an entire new ideology that combines the worst of the worst ideologies, communism and fascism, brings them together into an ideology that he calls fourth political theory. His assertion, and what Putin subscribes to, is that you basically had the three political theories. You had communism, fascism, and liberalism. He says that the only problem with communism, well, the main problems with communism and fascism is that they weren't able to defeat liberalism, which he sees as a product of the West and results in decadence and is destined to catastrophe. He sees it as evil, and that's why he created the fourth political theory, which takes the ideas of communism and fascism, brings them together into this new ideology, which is designed to oppose liberalism. What is liberalism in his view? It is Western society. It's capitalism. It is the Enlightenment. It's individualism. It is even rational thought. He's opposed to it. He wants to tear it down. And beyond that, you'll find the agenda for Russian expansionism and a return to Russian imperialism in his ideas that he gets from the German Nazi philosopher Martin Heidegger. And I've been reading Dugin's books to learn about this, where you're quite right, Jeff. You hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the Black Sea. It's integral to what Russia and Putin want to do, feel they need to do, and that is to expand. In fact, they see expansionism as an existential necessity. That's a quote from Alexander Dugin himself. Without expanding, Russia is destined, essentially, he says, to expand because it is what he calls a tellurocracy, which is a land-based power. And it is destined to basically expand all across Eurasia. The United States, the UK, these other powers over time, they are thalassocracies, which are sea-based powers that expanded because they were able to use the seas to go out and colonize other countries. And this is where there's this sort of a postmodernist interpretation of history and even the modern geopolitical realities today come from with Putin and Dugin. They're seeing the world carved up into larger, a multipolar geopolitical reality, a new world order, if you will, of Russia dominating Eurasia, but having access to the sea through Ukraine, and the Western powers like the United States. You're seeing it actually unfold right now with this talk about taking Greenland all the way down to Mexico. I'm sorry, but this actually falls right into line with what he's saying. I wish I wasn't saying this because I feel like I'm a conspiracy theorist, realizing that the conspiracy is true.
He might have just provided an apt assessment of where things are headed.
Except that in his writings, he says that this has to happen.
Well, and I was just going to say, like, a lot of this postmodernist. Well, the thing is that I think you're going to find that there's a common thread from him to Marx, and there's a lot of other guys along the way. They're I mean, they're going to their Marxist-Leninist roots, right? And
in this case, also to the fascist roots of Nazi Germany and the writings of Martin Heidegger. And I know that this is happening, and I know that it's being promoted in this way because I'm seeing even because this ideology is even being exported to the West through, and I don't even want to say the names of the groups because I don't want to promote it, but I know some of the people involved, and some of them have started out as communists, and now they're adopting Dugin's teachings and promoting it here in the West as well. But anyway, and this, so it's a communo-fascistic ideology that brings both of them together. It's convergence. And the reason it appeals so much to people, even within the freedom movement, the conservative side of things in the West, which he actually sees as a Western ally to a degree at this point, is because his ideology rejects things like a secular society. It calls for a return to orthodox traditional values, which appeals very much to, say, Christians. And it stands against homosexuality, LGBTQ, drag queen story time, all of this kind of stuff, right?
Does he endorse
progressiveness? He endorses a return to traditional values. And he says that, and this is also his assault on Western society and even rational thought. He sees liberalism as a product of the West, and he wants to oppose that in every way. He needs to destroy it. And so, because he sees that as an existential threat to Russia, he wants a return to traditional values. But you see, he says that there's no.
So
this is very. Now we're getting into complex philosophy.
That's okay. I like this stuff. I'm just not familiar with Dugin, but I can sense these kind of like common threads. Like I said, that's why I was asking about Christianity, because one guy that was actually more influential than people realize was Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian communist that was jailed by the fascists in 1921. He founded the Communist Party of Italy, but he was probably jailed somewhere right around there, 1921. And he was the guy that came up with the idea of a cultural hegemony and said that we had to take control, or the Marxists, the socialists would have to take control of the cultural hegemony and shape the society over time. And this is really kind of, I guess, transitory between him and Lenin. Lenin was more like 1917, so before him. But Lenin was the guy who, because even though Marx called the workers of the world to unite and overthrow the bourgeoisie, they never did. So Lenin was the guy who went from that radicalism to extremism and actually applied violence to bring about the revolution himself. He said that, the proletariat needed a class of elites to steward them through the revolution, basically. And with the Gramsci component too, that he was also influential in Chinese communism at its founding, and also in during the not the Cultural Revolution, but there was the campaign of 1,000,000 flowers, something about 1,000,000 flowers. Let 1,000,000 flowers bloom is what Mao said, and they started opening up to Western thought, and they almost revolted, and then they shut it all down again. But they brought Gramsci back in the 90s with Deng Xiaoping, it's they're greasy, motherless bastards. You have to understand that. Like, they're never going to take us on in a fair fight. It's all about this kind of psychological warfare and just assaulting your sense of reality, essentially negating it. It's a Hegelian attack. Like, the Hegelian dialectics is what Marx used to form his dialectical materialism, which is basically everything that we're dealing with right now, especially intersectionalism, which is kind of like Marx's dialectical materialism on steroids, where they just kind of hurl an opposing view at whatever it is that you're trying to do. You're trying to stand on a Western value, like, say, border security, then you'll be called xenophobic, or if I'm really hawkish about things like global jihad, and I get called Islamophobic a lot, this kind of thing. So and the whole purpose of it is to, like, just not just to gaslight you, but basically negate your sense of reality and get you, looking for the approval, change all the social cues to manipulate you, so that you get whipped up into this mass formation psychosis, I guess, on a permanent basis. And that's basically what's going on with everybody else in the world. Like, we in the West are the ones whose minds are free to a degree, more so than everybody else. And the rest of the world is kind of still stuck on that default setting of totalitarian of the human species. And sophistry is the language of the totalitarian. Like, that was the story of Socrates, and he was the one he fought the foreign war against Sparta in his young life. He lived through the major crisis, which was the occupation by Sparta during his midlife. This is the whole cycle of history. Like, I fought the Mujahideen, or I served in the war where we fought the Mujahideen in my young life, and now we're being occupied by the Mujahideen in my midlife. And this is the major crisis. And then when he was in his old age, he saw, like, the same social trends recurring, like the sophistry was resurging, and he explained them to be those who make the weaker argument the stronger. And eventually the formal logic came with Aristotle not long thereafter, where they formalized logic. And Socrates was the initial, like, syllogism in the Socratic method, but Aristotle, and I recommend everybody do this, just get familiar with the logical fallacies. Like, if you can memorize like 10 common logical fallacies, you can annihilate these people. If you can just identify exactly where the flaw in their reasoning is, then it's dead in the water. You win. But the sophists have basically just sort of built on their tactics over the millennia, and they seem to take the lessons learned from the last time this came around. So yeah, now we have, like, the post-Marxists came a little bit later and stuff with the critical theorists in Germany, and they were also, like, greasy bastards who talked about taking control of the institutions and the political apparatus over generations, changing the society again. Max Horkheimer, and there was even like what's that bastard's name? Volodymyr Zelensky was the guy who coined the phrase cisgender, which is now in Bill C-4. So we've institutionalized Marxism and made it the law of the land. He studied under Max Horkheimer, by the way, his philosophical studies. But the liberating tolerance, that's Herbert Marcuse. That's where the left gets carte blanche and the right gets the boot. You can see these kind of common threads. That I think what we're discussing is whatever Dugin has is something like this Hegelian melding together of communism and fascism, and the Hegelian dialectic is the one where, like, thesis meets antithesis, and then they through a process of negation where the weak parts kind of fade away and only the strong parts are left, a new idea or a new concept is formed, a stronger, better one, and that was the concept that Marx weaponized. But that's what Hegel kind of postulated, I guess, as a means of kind of like debate. But anyway, it seems like they've taken a lot of, they've gotten back to their Marxist-Leninist roots, but at the same time, you're saying that it's fascist, so usually that has an ethnic component to it. Like that was really the only difference between the fascists and the communists. They were all just incestuous cousins who often fought on the socialist spectrum, and even Hitler said like they just kind of dispensed with all of the highfalutin BS that Marx had wrapped up in what was probably a pretty good idea in terms of how to structure a system of government, but I don't even know about that. But anyway, but yeah, I mean the Nazis were rooted in Marxism. Everybody was. So yeah, I think it sounds like this guy is just sort of dusting off a lot of these lessons learned from the previous eras, and through the Marxist Hegelian dialectical synthesis is coming up with some new system that involves like the class warfare component of it, and as well as there's got to be an ethno-nationalist kind of component of it when it comes to I think the fascist aspect of it.
Well,
am I about right? Am I tracking you?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it is his philosophy is a bit different, and it goes all the way to like, what is this? It's a cup, right?
Sure.
No, it's whatever you want it to be, because there's no reality. It's an interpretation, and then
the postmodernists. Yeah,
there is a postmodernist component to this, even though he rejects progressivism.
Yeah,
and yet it's still there. And he blames all the ills of the world on the West through liberalism, where he's saying that liberalism is essentially the embodiment of evil. He blames communism and fascism on the West as Western ideas that failed humanity. Liberalism itself fails humanity. He sees liberalism as something that is destined to self-destruct and has to be defeated through this fourth political theory. And he's saying that it's racist for anyone to criticize other countries' cultures, but it's okay. In fact, liberalism itself has to be torn apart and destroyed. So if, for instance, if there's a culture that believes in cannibalism, it's like, that's okay. We can't criticize that because that's their reality. That's their interpretation. So you have to go with that. You have to respect that, right? And you can't criticize Russia's heritage or traditions because that's all rooted in tradition, which is not liberalism, and it's not what we have in the West. But everything from the West is destined to self-destruct. It's going to destroy the world, so we have to destroy liberalism. And that is a very, very probably not entirely clear or adequate explanation, but that's where he's coming at from this. And so it's an attack on the West. Yeah.
It's pretty standard totalitarianism.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But the problem here is that this is what now predicates Russian foreign policy. This is his work, and you would say, some people argue, well, he's not actually in there. Dugin's not in there making policy with Putin. No, it's worse than that, because he is actually involved in shaping the way people think within Russian society. It's these concepts, his ideas, that are pushing all of this. And this is really what has pushed Russia into Ukraine. This idea that Ukraine isn't a real nation state. They don't recognize it as legitimate. That's their interpretation of it, that Ukrainian culture doesn't exist. The Ukrainian language is an aberration of the West, And the very existence of Ukraine is the existential threat to Russia, and that anyone that subscribes to or tries to hold on to the ideas of Ukrainian culture, they have to be basically eliminated and even killed. Here's a Russian propagandist. What's this guy's name? He's like a rapper. I can't recall his name offhand. I'll get it for you before we end on this. But here he is talking about this very thing. This is how you might say that this isn't the official policy, but it is, because Dugin's writings are now required reading in the Russian military academy. This predicates Russian foreign policy. This is what is driving Russian society right now and the war into Ukraine. And just listen to the way this guy talks. For me, what's happening is a natural process. Okay, he's talking about the war. I'm not idealizing war, he says. I understand that war is dirty with ripped off limbs and orphaned children. It's the darkness and the stench. But this is the only way we can exist. Unfortunately, there is no other way.
Существовать или выживать?
To exist or to survive, the host asks. He says, to exist.
Вы должны воевать не из чувства ненависти.
We should wage war not out of hatred.
Я в 2014 году я пережил эти все состояния. Я сначала ненавидел их искренне, потом начал пытаться их понять. И вот сейчас у меня сформировалась внятная позиция. Я их не ненавижу. Они тоже носители идеи. Мы должны их убить не из чувства ненависти. Мы должны их убить из чувства любви к своим детям. Потому что это обеспечит наше выживание. Все просто.
Почему ты считаешь?
They go on about this, and this is not isolated. This is, you can find this kind of dialogue through Russian media, through the writings of the philosophers, the policies. It's about expansionism, imperialism, and reasserting Russia's dominance in the Baltics and taking those countries back. There are now 5 frozen conflicts. Putin keeps saying, no, we're not going to invade. We don't want to occupy any part of Ukraine. That's what he kept saying, right up until the day before they actually launched the full-scale invasion, which he calls a special military operation. No, they're involved in Moldova, in Georgia, in, what do they call it, Ternitsia, in that other part of Georgia. They're already involved in expansionist activities. Here's Dugin himself talking about this idea of, and you have to understand that Dugin is integral to all this. He's got Putin's ear. More than that, he's got Putin's mind. He has been the architect of all of this. And I'll just run this clip. And he's telling you exactly what the war is about right here.
All right.
Here we go.
Without Ukraine, Russia cannot become once more the empire. With Ukraine inside of Russian zone of control, it will become empire once more. That is a kind of law. Nothing personal. This war or military operation, special military operation in Ukraine is about that. It is about geopolitics. Without you,
that's the man himself. Like, I don't know what else to tell. Like, it's not about NATO expansionism. It's about geopolitics. It's about Russia and Eurasianism and expansionism into Eurasia and creating a greater Russia.
Yeah, I believe that. I'm not really finding much to disagree with you on, Rick. Like, it's not like a debate, like in the sense that it's an argument.
Right.
Obviously, it's quite educational, actually. I accept. I mean, they're totalitarian in Russia, so this is what it looks like. They're brainwashed. Okay, it's just like it's a religion. It's their faith. We can see it like in our own society, right? When you say something true, the wokesters get triggered, and it's it's like a visceral response followed by a quick burst of rage. It's the blasphemy reaction. You're the heretic, and they're just going for the pitchforks. It's interesting to see the inverted paradigm through this lens too, because we basically live in an inverted paradigm right now while we're struggling with totalitarianism. Good is evil and evil is good. It's opposite land. Everything is completely upside down, and that's the way they see the world. Like we're getting a kind of appreciation for that, not necessarily a healthy one, I guess, but the victim mentality, that it's all happening to them, and this idea that I find fascinating is that they seem to think that they are in a struggle for the human mind to preserve what they have. And I resemble that remark. I can empathize with that. It's like, you can see that we're always struggling with this sort of teeter on the brink of global totalitarianism, and it's the default setting on the human species. Once we kind of become unmoored from empirical reality with philosophy,
but here's the problem.
Yeah,
who was threatening the existence of Russia? It's the other way around.
Exactly.
And in fact,
exactly
the reason I've made the thumbnail the way I did tonight is I say this is Ukraine's last chance. And the reason I chose that title is because this really is the last chance for Ukraine to actually exist, not only as a nation state, but as a culture, as a people. Because if they're defeated, their language, their culture will be destroyed. That is what they're getting at here. They want to wipe that away because they see that as an existential threat to Russia. I guess you could say it's sort of the reverse of what we have here in Canada with the French population, where they see their culture potentially being wiped away by English-speaking or Anglophones, right? Mm-hmm. So we've given them certain protections in our society. But if we saw French as the existential threat to English and didn't respect that and decided to just wipe them away, well, it wouldn't even be as bad as what's going on in Ukraine, because that's Ukraine. This would be like wiping France off the map. This is why when Ukraine was producing these videos showing bombed libraries early in the conflict, and I was like, why are they showing us bombed libraries? That's not going to convince people to support them. People here are not going to care if they bomb a library, but it's because to them, it's the core issue. It's about, do we survive as a people? Now, that means preserving your language, your culture, it even came down this Christmas to what day you get to celebrate Christmas. You ask, does Dugin support Christianity? Well, they support the Russian Orthodox Church, which is a state-sanctioned church, but not Ukrainian religion. They don't support people having Christmas on December 25th.
I guess I was just interested because Antonio Gramsci said that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity.
He said what? What was it?
He said that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity or displace it.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess I was just interested for that. The socialists tend to be very anti-Christian.
Yeah. And so while they're accusing Ukraine of trying to destroy the Russian-speaking population, it's actually the other way around. It's all upside down world. And it's all one lie after another, after another, after another. And then people say, well, why should we care? Why should we support Ukraine? Because I put it to you that people like General Wesley Clark, who was just on the Piers Morgan show in an actual larger debate about this, that was really quite good, I thought. I mean, he lays it out quite eloquently. He was there during the end of the Cold War. He was involved in a lot of these talks, even as Crimea was taken. And he's quite right that they're not going to stop. And what's going on in Ukraine is an existential threat to Ukraine, to Ukrainian culture, to the Ukrainian speaking people there who have not outlawed people.
Oh, am I frozen? I might be. Rick, you're frozen on my end. Let me check the chats here. Am I frozen or is Rick? Oh, Rick's frozen? Okay. Sandy's letting me know that Rick is frozen. Okay. I'll try to fill some airtime while Rick gets that sorted out. All good. So I guess what I was just thinking as he was speaking, as I said, like all of this is really educational. And I try to take a more nuanced view on things. The two things can be true at the same time. So it can be true that Russia's the aggressor, and everything he's saying, I think, adds up very well. And it can also be true that this war wouldn't be happening right now under the stewardship of the great Donald Trump. And so my basic sort of 5,000 foot view operating assumption has been that Joe Biden took a bribe from the Chinese to let it happen. However it happened, although there's a lot about the narrative that's always suspect. So I think Rick is doing a fabulous job of dispelling a lot of these myths, and you can see the same patterns. Like it's the same tactics, the same structure to the narrative, where they have this. Out. Are you guys still hearing me?
We're back.
Oh,
okay.
Wait a second. There I am.
Yeah, and that's the internet here, which I've been having trouble with. And they came and said they fixed it yesterday, and obviously they didn't. So my internet problems go on. I don't know, where did we leave off before we got the big black hole in the middle of the program?
I was let me see. Actually, I was talking because apparently I was here while you were frozen, and so it was just me for a couple of minutes there. And
Okay.
what I was saying is, like, obviously, I'll repeat that. It's been very educational, and I can accept that two things can be true at the same time. Like Russia can be the aggressor in this, and it also wouldn't be happening if Donald Trump were in charge. And I guess my basic sort of assessment of the situation, and this is kind of a 5,000 foot view. I didn't delve into nearly as much detail as you have, but what I was looking at was basically it looks like Joe Biden took a $5 million bribe to let it happen. And he took that from a Chinese oligarch, and now China has an ally with Russia that we've trying, everything about American foreign policy has been to avoid that exact nightmare scenario. So it's a geopolitical sabotage.
You could that position for a while, but I see
break it up a little bit, Rick,
as inevitable.
Okay.
It is their agenda. This is something that he's
Yes.
going to do. He is doing it regardless
Oh, yeah.
of who is in the White House, and it's a long game that they're playing, right?
I know.
And
for
and
4 years, Donald Trump was in there because he expanded under Obama, and he expanded.
yeah,
under Biden,
they
under
actually well,
Trump.
yes, they did. That's the point.
Under Trump?
They were active in there. Yes, they took. They went in and took Crimea. Then they were active in the Donbass. This is why it became such a hot issue when Trump first took office, and was he going to give them weapons or not? And he did give them the Javelin missiles. But Dugin, you see, the real reason that I think they didn't become more aggressive at the time is because they saw Trump and they see MAGA and the right, not just in And I've got a clip. I'm not going to run it because too many clips. But Dugin sees the right in America, the right political movement, the MAGA movement, and other right-wing movements in other countries as sort of being, for the moment, allied with Russia, because they're fighting liberalism, progressivism. But at the end of the day, they're going to come for the freedom fighters. They're going to come for the MAGA movement as well, because they still represent a secular society and a liberal democracy, which they see as sinful, a decadent society that needs to be destroyed. So that's ultimately where they want to go with this, regardless of who is in the White House. Now, that's also why they are acting the way they are acting in Ukraine, and why we need to stand against this, because this is a cultural genocide inside Ukraine. And it is a physical genocide as well. Look at the numbers that dwarf anything going on in Gaza in terms of the number of people killed.
World War II, for that matter.
Yes. I mean, huge numbers of casualties. And it's because Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yes.
And they're not going to stop, because they see that the ideology dictates that they see Ukraine as the existence of Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia. You've just heard two people, including the architect of all this, say that Russia can't achieve its greatness again unless it absorbs Ukraine again. And they're in the process of doing that. Also, that rapper propagandist guy who was also fighting over there in the Donbass and in Crimea, he talks about the children who have been kidnapped, that Russia denied that they were doing this, that they were kidnapping Ukrainian children. And then when it became public that they were involved in this, and they've taken tens of thousands of Ukrainian children, the claim is that they were protecting them because they were in danger in a war zone. But they've made no effort to return these children to their parents. They're keeping them, and they're re-educating them or educating them by Russifying them. And this is a cultural genocide that I think some people here in Western society, in Canada, in the United States, might relate to when you talk about a cultural genocide with regard to First Nations peoples. But this is on a level that is unprecedented. That's what Zelensky talks about in the Friedman interview as well. He talks about that's why he would really only speak Ukrainian, or would only speak the other languages periodically during the interview, but mainly spoke in Ukrainian. Because for him, this is Russia and being an existential threat to the very existence of Ukraine. That's why I put in the thumbnail, I titled this program, Ukraine's Last Chance. If they lose, Ukrainian culture will be wiped away. That's what the objective here is, because they see it as an existential threat to Russia and Russian culture, the very existence of the country.
Yeah, I believe that. I think I was saying at some point that it's basically a border skirmish, and it's not really any of our business. The way you're describing it here, I think my position is evolving. It sounds like, I mean, like it does kind of sound like I didn't know about this Dugin guy. I have to admit, and I'm usually pretty hip to the philosophy behind these movements. So I guess I just haven't found the time to dive into him yet, but I will.
Yeah. And Putin, even in the Tucker Carlson interview, he goes into the history of Ukraine and Russia, but it's a revised history. And he just hands these documents to Carlson, and he doesn't challenge it. He just accepts it, but it's integral to the whole thing, because he says, Putin argues that Ukraine has just always been part of Russia, and that it's just become distorted and an aberration over time. But the truth of the matter is that the territory, and I've got some notes here, the territory of modern Ukraine has been inhabited since ancient times, with civilizations like the Kievan Rus going back to the 9th and the 13th centuries. And I mean, Putin has to go all the way back to those times. And then even then he has to twist the history to justify what he is doing by saying that Ukrainian culture doesn't matter. There's not, and Dugin as well in his books, there's nothing culturally significant about Ukraine. It doesn't deserve to exist. The Zaporizhian Cossacks established a semi-autonomous state known as the Cossack Hetmanate in the 17th century, which was centered in what is now central and eastern Ukraine. And then that period further developed the concept of Ukrainian statehood. After the fall of the Russian Empire in 1917, Ukraine declared independence as the Ukrainian People's Republic, although the state was short-lived due to the subsequent civil war and Soviet invasion. They've been like a doormat used for either, the Germans or the Soviets or the Polish or whomever. And then the treaty between the Central Powers and Soviet Russia in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, acknowledged that the Ukrainian People's Republic was an independent state. Now, after World War II, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was one of the founding members of the United Nations in 1945, which inherently recognized it as a sovereign entity within the framework of international law, even if under Soviet control. So even at that time, it was actually its own entity. Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union on August 24th, 1991, following the failed August coup in Moscow, and that was overwhelmingly confirmed by a national referendum on December 1st of 1991, where over 90% of voters voted and supported for independence. It became an independent country. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was recognized by over 130 countries, and by the end of 1991, it had that status, including major powers like the United States were involved in recognizing it, the European Union, and even Russia itself.
I mean, would not make the case that Ukraine should not be a country. That's definitely not my position. I think the part that's evolving is, whether they really need our help over there, whether they really need, all these arms and stuff, or whether that's just a big money laundering operation. Could they not have gone back to the table at some point?
I would argue no, and there have been documents leaked that show the very narrative that you're attaching to there, talking about the money laundering and too much money being spent and it's not worth it. That is actually one of the key talking points in the Russian propaganda campaign.
Right on. Okay. So like all this stuff about these Ukrainian diplomats having, lavish villas on islands and stuff is Russian disinfo?
150,000%. In fact, there's a lot of information out there, and I can tell you from personal contacts that a lot of the stories about Zelensky buying yachts and casinos, simply not true.
But he wears the fatigues to, Congress.
Yes, I know. I mean,
he's an actor.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
But the whole world is a stage, and regardless of whether he wears fatigues or a suit and tie, the reality is you need public support for anything that you're doing one way or the other. It is his job to go around and make sure that Ukraine has the support it needs to defend itself. And getting that support means going to foreign leaders and soliciting support from like the United States, other European countries, NATO countries, because Ukraine can't defend itself against a massive superpower like Russia. That's just the reality of the situation. So the question then is, well, is it up to us? And I would argue, yeah, it is, and there are a lot of reasons why, not the least of which is the Budapest Memorandum itself, where we promised that if they gave up those nukes, that we would not only respect the border of Ukraine, which Russia did as well, but if if they were to be invaded, we would defend them. And so in the interest of peace, Ukraine gave up the nukes. And now Russia has turned around and said, nope, no, we're just taking it. And we don't recognize Ukraine as a legitimate country. It's an illegitimate government. The Budapest Memorandum doesn't matter. Ukraine doesn't matter. It's not a real place. And then they went and spun up the whole narrative about the coup in 2014. And it's just the CIA again, just taking over. It's just a CIA coup in Ukraine, and it's just propaganda. It's not true. It was the other way around. They had their boy in there. They had Yanukovych, and when he was under pressure from the people because they were protesting because he was opposed to them integrating into the EU, which is really an extension of like the solidarity movement in a way that we saw in Poland after the fall of the Soviet Union, where people were liberated from the Soviet Union and became a free country. It's the same kind of thing now. And we promised to defend them. And now they've been invaded. And what are we supposed to do? Just say, oh, no, we were just kidding. The other reason we absolutely must do it is because we did make the promise. And if we don't live up to our promises, then nobody will ever trust us. And too many times, the United States and NATO have fallen short on those promises. And it looks to me like we may be about to do that again. Because Western democracies are unstable. You get a change in leadership, you change in government, you get a change in foreign policy. The new guy coming in doesn't follow through with what the old guy was doing. Yeah. It's unpredictable what's going to happen. And if we don't stand up and do what we promised to do, if we don't keep our promises, then no one is going to trust us and we'll be alone in the world. It will weaken us in the long run. You
don't have to sell me on that part. I definitely agree with you that like we need to honor our treaties and our commitments. I always thought, because I did a tour in Iraq in 2019 and I did a good chunk of it in what many people would call Kurdistan. So, but there's no Kurdistan. There probably should be, or should have been under the British mandate. But there isn't. And those guys, oh my God, like we have not been good allies to them, and somehow they still love us. But man, I mean, we left them to Saddam Hussein. Like he gassed them at one point. Like I think both times the Americans went in, like the Kurds were high and dry on their way out. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah,
it's a perfect example. I cite that myself sometimes when having these kinds of discussions. We can't be doing that. And right now, like this conflict in particular, to me, this one is pivotal. It's critical. If we allow if we allow Ukraine to be destroyed and no longer, if we allow it to cease to exist, and that's what will happen. We will have failed, not only Ukraine, but the free world, ourselves. What good is freedom if we are afraid? What good is freedom here if we don't defend freedom with one of our partners and allies, a country that isn't even a NATO country, wasn't threatening anyone? What good is it if we just abandon them? And allow a dictator to just roll through there and just take it. Not only take it, but actually kill the people that won't bend the knee and adopt their ideology, their religion. If they won't reject Western society, if they won't reject the very things that we hold dear, which is rational thought, individualism, classical liberalism, not like big L Justin Trudeau liberalism, Western society itself. If they and their language, their culture, the way they dress, the way they practice their religion, what good are we when we promised that we would protect that? Who's going to come to our defense when we need it? I'll tell you right now, before all this stuff with the 51st state, really, really mushroomed, we had a call in, and a couple of Americans called in, and they made it very clear that if, first of all, they're quite happy about taking us over, and secondly, if another country was threatening us, they wouldn't come to our defense because they've got this America first mentality. They don't even want to defend us, and we're right on their border. So that's the mindset that's in play right now, and we need to support what these folks in Ukraine. They're being killed.
I still question, though, whether it was allowed to happen by Biden. That's kind of my main bone of contention. I don't want to see Ukraine get steamrolled or cease to exist. Certainly not. But yeah, I'm still kind of stuck on that. Like, would this be happening if Trump were in there, and what purpose does it serve? And well, you know what I came up with. So
sure, but the thing, Jeff, is, does that matter to the people who are being shot? Does it matter to the people of Bucha who were slaughtered, like to the tune of between 800 and 1,000 people, civilians, in a war crime committed by Russia, which they then turned around and used their online influencers to lie about that very thing on this program? Okay, I had them on. Oh no, it was the Ukrainians who did it, only to then discover myself, as I kept on digging, and then found that other investigative journalists over time compiled all kinds of evidence to show that it was the Russians all along. And undeniable proof that they did all of this stuff, that they slaughtered the people, and then the Russian soldiers took the cell phones of the victims and called home on the victims' cell phones at a time when we were told the Russian soldiers weren't supposed to be there at all anymore. They'd already left, and it was the Ukrainians who had come in to kill their own people. So yeah, goddamn right. We got to support that. We got to support the people if that's what they're up against. I'll say this too. I'll go a step further. To the influencers who came on this damn show and lied about it, they're as guilty of that war crime as the people who pulled the triggers, as far as I'm concerned. And I am here tonight because I need to make things right. I need, as a journalist, as someone who believes in freedom and justice, I need to make sure that I set the record straight. That's what I'm doing here, and that's what I'm fighting for, because that's actual truth. That's not Dugan truth. That's not, truth can be whatever you want it to be, because if Dugan were here, he would say, well, what people? Did those people even exist? How can you prove that those people were even there? Those people might not, that's just, there was nobody there. No, that didn't happen. No, that was the Ukrainians doing it to their own people. Don't you? Of course it was, because they're corrupt. No, the empirical evidence proves undeniably, hard facts, photos, videos, time-stamped communications, cell phone records, the list goes on. It's hard documented, absolute war crime. And it would be, I would be as guilty as the people who committed the crime. I would be complicit if I didn't call this out. That's my damn job. That's why I'm here tonight.
Well, you're doing a fantastic job, Rick. I'll say that. Digging into to all this is great info. Yeah, and no, it doesn't matter if they really are caught in a an existential crisis. I can definitely accept that. I guess.
And let me come back to the Yaroslav Hunka in Canadian Parliament scandal. Oh, yeah. Okay, total embarrassment. How do you even defend that? I would put it to you that was a setup, that we have people within our own government who facilitated that in order to embarrass our own country, because we are not a Nazi nation, but there are people who want to paint us in that way and portray us as a bunch of Nazis who harbor Ukrainian Nazis within our own border, who brought Nazis here after World War II because we're a bunch of Nazis. Mark my words, that's what the way they portray us. Putin has talked about Canada himself multiple times because of that very incident. He's using it as a talking point, as a propaganda tool. I take offense to it. Because even in the case of Yaroslav Hunka, who I can't defend because he did fight with the Nazis, but I'll put this to you. The whole Russian narrative on denazification, on Ukraine being just a bunch of Nazis, that is also not cut and dried. And the very person that they demonize the most, Stepan Bandera, I'm sure you've heard the name. No? Okay, well, there are statues to Stepan Bandera because he believed in Ukrainian independence. Ukraine has been fighting for their independence for a long time. I just went through a bunch of the history, not even all of it. But during the Soviet era, the Soviets were, Stepan Bandera was fighting against the Soviets because he was a Ukrainian nationalist, much the same as you're a nationalist because you believe in nationalism. He was fighting
all
for
the nationalist Nazis.
Yeah, well, so Bandera, like all Ukrainians, when the Nazis came in, when Germany came in to Ukraine and pushed the Russians out, a lot of Ukrainians were very hopeful. They were like, we're being liberated, because they didn't know what the Nazis were. It was a brand new thing. They'd never really seen this before. Not like that. They didn't know about the Holocaust. They didn't know that this was going on. So they were hopeful that this was the answer to their oppression after the Holodomor in the 1930s, the oppression of the Soviet Union under Stalin, the murders that they'd suffered, the mass killings, the oppression. The Germans come in, but they soon found out that the Nazis were just as bad. And even though the Russians today have, and the very beginning of the conflict in Ukraine this time around, they're propping up Stepan Bandera, saying what an evil guy he is. This is the ultimate Nazi. The Ukrainians still worship this guy. They look at Chrystia Freeland holding up a Bandera banner, like a scarf thing, in a photo, and say, you see these Canadians, Freeland, the Canadian government, they're just a bunch of Nazis too. They idolize Stepan Bandera. But here's a little bit of an inconvenient truth on Stepan Bandera. The Nazis put Stepan Bandera in jail. They arrested him because when they came in 1941, he declared part of Ukraine in Lviv to be an independent state. And he was hoping that the Germans would support him and his organization of Ukrainian nationalists in establishing Ukraine as an independent nation state. And they had none of it. So they went to Lviv and they arrested him. So he didn't fight with the Nazis. They put him in jail. Now the OUN actually split into two groups. The OU, the part under Bandera, and then there was Andrei Melnik, which formed a second faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and they kind of split up. And yeah, some of them did fight with the Nazis, as did many Ukrainians, but a lot of Ukrainians also fought with the Russians. Bandera stood against them both. That's why they hate him. You know why they hate Chrystia Freeland so much? Not just because of her shrill voice, not just because she grates on us all. Okay, the reason they really hate Chrystia Freeland is because when she was a student, she went to university in Moscow and she got involved in research, and she has Ukrainian roots. And so the research that she did, which was happening even after the fall of the Soviet Union, she uncovered and researched and wrote extensively about Russian war crimes in World War II. And they don't like that. And she was talking about stuff that you're not allowed to talk about. And even back then, you weren't allowed to talk about the Holodomor. And even now, if you're not really allowed, you're not supposed to talk about the Holodomor in Russia. That's taboo. That'll get you into a whole lot of trouble. Chrystia Freeland talked about it a lot. That's why they banned her from the country. So my hat goes off to the woman who I find shrill and I wouldn't vote for, but she stood up to them, and thank you, Chrystia Freeland, for that, because that's truth, and that took bravery even when she was younger. So I see both sides of things, even in a government that I don't like and won't support, and even in a finance minister and deputy prime minister, former, that I think is guilty of a lot of things in our country. But on that point, I understand why the Russians hate her, and it's not because she's just Canadian. It's because she was a truth teller in that instance.
Interesting.
So,
but, yeah, it was a setup. I could see that, and it was to make us look bad. You think it was set up by the Russians, or I kind of yeah, okay.
Oh yeah, because they have people within, sympathizers. They have corrupt people within our government. We know that. It's not just China. It's Russia. It's Iran. It's China. And all of these countries are working together. They've formed this axis of resistance. Hello, it's World War III. We're under attack right now. What happened in Parliament was an act of war against us. This is fifth generation warfare. People don't understand it. They don't get what it is. That's what that was. And it's brilliant because we end up blaming ourselves for something that they cook up. Because you see,
you have any details about how they set it up, or do you know anything about it?
Nothing I can tell you in public.
Okay.
But it's insidious. And while I don't support what Yaroslav Hunka did as a Nazi soldier, I also understand that at the end of a war, you need to have peace. And the only way to get peace is to stop killing people. And that means that the losing army doesn't have to line up against a wall and be shot. It means that the killing stops. And then what do you do with these soldiers on the losing side, in this case, the Germans, who did horrific things? You vet them. You decide, where you're going to go. So a lot of these people left the country. Many of them came to Canada. And in the case of these Ukrainian soldiers, it's more complicated than anything, because there's a country that was used as a doormat, first by the Soviets, then by the Germans, then by the Russians again. And they're going in and out, and people are being told, you will fight with us. And if you don't, you're going to die. So what are you going to do? Now, they found the writings of Yaroslav Hunka, and they say, oh, he really believed in what he was doing. And if he was guilty of crimes, then so be it. Put the guy on trial, and if there are legitimate reasons to hold him accountable for things that he has done, then I am all for that. But these are things that happened long in the past. These are things that were vetted a long time ago. These people who came to our country and other countries, including Russia, because they took Germans as well, decisions were made at the time. What do we do with this person? Do we put them on trial in Nuremberg, or do we allow them to have a life? Do we move on? Does the killing stop? I'll tell you this, if the killing had continued, I think the war would have continued much more quickly than it has, and it's really happening right now. This is a continuation of the war. But I'll tell you this too, as much as Vladimir Putin wants to denazify Ukraine, he's the bloody Nazi, because he's embraced, with Alexander Dugin and his new ideology, a way of thinking and geopolitical policy that embraces the worst of everything that philosophy and politics has ever had to offer mankind. Communism and fascism, the worst elements of both, to form the most authoritarian ideology in the history of mankind. And it really represents the biggest existential threat, not just to freedom, but to human beings on the planet. Because one man has been threatening to use nukes over and over and over again. One guy, Vladimir Putin. keeps threatening to use the nukes, not because he's winning the war in Ukraine, but because he's losing. You do not threaten to use nuclear weapons unless you're losing and you're backed into a corner. And he has bitten off more than he can chew. In the long run, he has, because he's not really up against just Ukraine. This has been an assault on the West when there was really no actual existential threat to Russia to begin with. He's flipped it around. He's miscalculated. He's gone into Ukraine. And now he's got a big problem on his hands because a special military operation that he thought was going to be over in about a week is now spread into 3 years with a new president coming in. And I don't know what's going to happen there. But I'll tell you this, even if Donald Trump pulls support, Europe will not, because they see the threat, they're aware, and they are not going to let this go. They can't, because it's an existential threat to them.
I think he said he's going to end it on a day.
So he's now he's revised that, and he says within 6 months.
Oh, okay.
That was just yesterday or the day before. So the guy is full of bluster. It's not that simple, and he's in for a wake up call if he's not getting it already. It's not that simple, because Putin's not going to stop.
He said he was going to defeat ISIS in a year, and he beat him in 10 months. He absolutely estimated them in 10 months. So
but in this case,
he says he's going to end it. Yeah, I think it's probably maybe he's revised it in light of changing circumstances.
Except that didn't the guy who the guy in New Orleans, wasn't he flying an ISIS flag? So I'm not so sure that he defeated ISIS. And I keep hearing about ISIS in the news, so I don't think that he actually did defeat ISIS.
Well, I guess there's two ways. He defeated Daesh. I guess you could say that. But ISIS is an ideology. Like this is what this is the core of everything that we're talking about right now. Like even if Russia were to cease to exist, the ideology would persist because Russians would still be adherent to this Dugin ideology that you're talking about. So that is the battle for the human mind. I mean, most of the world is still stuck on their totalitarian setting. We are the only ones that believe in logic and debate and empirical evidence. And everybody else, it's a religion. It's just that the state is in the place of God. So I mean, you can see the commonalities, throughout. And ISIS, it's like Nathan Cirillo has gone down in an ISIS attack on at the National War Monument, just as I was getting posted into Ottawa. And even the debate back then, people were saying, oh, he wasn't a member of ISIS. And I was saying, no, it doesn't really work that way. They've openly said you don't have to sign up somewhere and show up at a place. You just have to, pledge allegiance to us and go do some horrible things. And that's what you get, is you get sympathizers, I guess, these kinds of sympathy attacks. So that's what I think we're looking at, in the sense that he defeated ISIS, and ISIS doesn't control territory anymore. At the time, like Daesh, I guess that's what we call them in the militaries. That's their Arabic name. We don't legitimize Hezbollah by calling them the Party of God, so we say Daesh. But Daesh doesn't control territory anymore. Whereas, previously, they took over 3 or 4 Iraqi cities, and then you had Boko Haram pledging allegiance to them, and they controlled parts of North Africa. And so I mean, it was a huge territory that they controlled. It was we didn't recognize their statehood, but for all intents and purposes, it was a state. They were running a state. So he crushed that, but the ideology persists.
Yeah. And I'm not suggesting that we should go for regime change in Russia.
Yeah, because they're a nuclear power.
And I'm not suggesting that at all. But I think that I think it's imperative that we live up to our promises, protect people who can't protect themselves, recognize that contrary to the Russian narrative. And you can refer to General Wesley Clark on this. His view is, and he was there, is that NATO expansionism has been occurring not because NATO has been pushing into these countries. On the contrary, a lot of these other countries like Finland, Poland, all this, the countries around Russia, generally NATO has been very cautious about granting them NATO membership. And that is because they do see it as potentially problematic, but these countries have been asking for it because they see the threat from Russia, which ties back into this traditionalism and, Putin's, I guess, sadness at the destruction of the old Soviet Union, which he sees as a tragedy. And he wants to bring it back. Yeah. And also because they see that Russia is not stopping. And they've already, for the people who think that Russia will just stop, they've already gone beyond Ukraine. Because as I mentioned before, you've got 5 frozen conflicts in Transnistria, which is part of Moldova, where they, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Transnistria declared independence from Moldova, leading to a brief war in 92, and then Russian peacekeepers are still there, controlling that part of Moldova. And we just saw Russian meddling in the elections there that just took place. That was very disruptive because they want to control the whole area again.
So
Azerbaijan, Georgia.
In terms of, I guess, defeating them, because you mentioned like regime change and things like that. I think like the strategy has always been containment, and it's all of these ideologies are self-defeating. Basically, like this stuff is going to implode because it's not coherent. Right. Like we're the only ones who are coherent, in the case of Russia, I mean, the country is basically run by about 300 oligarchs, and that's it. A lot of people have already fled. The capital is fleeing, and they've decided, because of this ethno-nationalist component, that they're going out Russian. Now, the Japanese had decided that as well, but they only just recently started opening up to immigration. The problem is, like, they have an inverted population pyramid, and this is what happens. It's the whole cycle of history. It happens every 4 generations. You have a baby boom in the wake of the previous major crisis, that one being World War II. So we have a baby boomer generation everywhere from China, Russia, Japan, the West, all over the place. So, In the case of Japan, they've just opened up to some immigration. Previously, it looked like they were like, no, we're going out Japanese. But now they're saying, how about if Japan continues to be a country, but we blend the ethnicity a little bit, and their immigration is very strict. With Russia, they're not doing that. They're not, getting any kind of like replacement migration or anything like that. And this is a thing. This is, I think, a big driver, especially, the appetite for increased immigration in the West has a lot to do with the fact that all the generations coming up behind the boomer generation are smaller and smaller. So there just aren't enough young people to support the old people. I mean, it's always been the case that you need to have enough kids to take care of you when you're old. And we built up these systems that make that care a little less visible. It's not direct anymore, but we have the Canada Pension Plan, and I mentioned that the last time we were here, and it's $1 trillion they have $1 trillion in unfunded liabilities, and they need new people to pay into it, and so I can't help but wonder how much that is a driving factor behind a lot of the appetite for immigration. Anyway, then there's the mass immigration, which I think is another 5th generational attack. It's the Chinese talk about it in unrestricted warfare, weaponized migration. So, and look at what they're bringing, right? It's like the jihadis, it's the Khalistanis, it's a lot of unskilled.
I did actually look into the Canada Pension Plan thing.
Did you know?
I did, and I'm not as worried as you are. Okay. I'm on the surface, I would be pretty worried, but there are 2 accounting approaches to it. One's called the open accounting method. The other is the closed accounting method, and it's 2 ways of looking at it, sort of short term and long term. And in the short term, there's plenty of money in there to fund the current generation.
Surplus, actually.
There's a surplus, but on the open and the long run, there isn't enough, but we're talking decades into the future. So there's still time to adjust for this. And it's also depends on how much economic growth we can maintain or how much growth we'll have over time. And I would argue that given the track record of free markets and sort of half free markets that we have in the West, and a sort of a capitalistic system. We're very, very powerful, and with a little bit of tweaking and adjusting, we can come out on the good side of that in the long run.
I hope so. I think what's particularly suspicious about it, though, is that the unfunded liabilities just keep going up and up and up. Like, where's that going? It's already over $1 trillion now.
We're talking like 20 years out, and there's lots of money. You go 40, 50 years, and things start to fall apart. But that's why we have lots of time to make adjustments. But that's for another show. That's accounting stuff. And I would also argue that a lot of that is people using that as an issue for to score political points at times, and to just get people, concerned. So vote for me or support something political. I get it, and I'm concerned about it, but a little fiscal austerity and some smart investments, and away you go. Speaking of investments, did you know Russia has chewed up more than half of its sovereign wealth fund to fund its war?
Yeah. I think I have heard that. They're basically teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, and they probably decimated about 2/3 of their military resources.
Yes. So, yeah. Well, and how accurate that is, we're dealing maybe with some propaganda there. But even if you took 20% or 30% of that away, they've got a problem. As much as these BRICS nations seem to pose a major threat to our economy, and I think it is destabilizing to us, the reality is it's all integrated. The world economy it's a global economy. It's all integrated. So.
Yeah, and with the BRICS nations, I think the question has always been, like, can these people actually work together? You're going to bring all the low trust societies across the globe together to form an economic partnership. How's that going to go? So yeah, and you know what? It hasn't really gone so well. So there's a lot of, I guess, concern around the possibility that they would release a currency, but Donald Trump said, anybody who does that, anybody who tries to undermine us, we're going to sanction the hell out of you. And these guys are already teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. I mean, the Chinese, the Russians, and they have the same problem in China with the inverted population pyramid. And they don't like immigrants either. They really don't like black people. But like they allow them in for work and stuff like that. But they're not going to be intermarrying or anything like that. They're ethno-supremacist. So these are all incredibly destabilizing forces. We might see these empires collapse within the next 10 years. And that's kind of what I've been saying is I think the strategy is for us is to weather the storm. We got to harden up against these forces that, it's like an earthquake. You're not going to be able to stop it. And we need to be thinking like long term in terms of our strategy, just sort of outlasting them, degrading them, and containing and mitigating the damage. So and they'll just sort of collapse on their own. But they're doing all the same things to us. So
yeah, I think though that when I hear talk like that, I push back a little bit against it now, because I think that a lot of that comes from foreign interference and the ongoing effort that has been taking place over generations to have us lose faith, trust, and even love of our own country.
Yeah.
And so I think that we need to stop talking bad about our own country, hold our politicians accountable, but start saying more positive things about Canada.
Well, but you're absolutely right. Like, we've been subjected to a campaign of demoralization for decades, for generations, in fact. And, Yuri Bezmenov said that they demoralized the boomer generation when they were in school. And it was too late to stop ideological subversion, because that generation was now in the institutions working to gradually turn them against us. And now they're at peak institutional power. And what do we have coming out of, the universities? It's basically all the propaganda of our adversaries. They're anti-Semitic and everything. So, and they're communist, and the narrative, like our history has been rewritten, and the Russians have been using the anti-colonialist narrative in the Middle East and Africa since the end of the Second World War to destabilize Western colonies there, so they can bring those regions into their economic orbit, and they have been pretty successful actually at doing a lot of that, and they're not better off. Like they're better off with Western colonialism. Zimbabwe probably being the best case in point, was Rhodesia before, as in Cecil Rhodes of rodeo scholarship, and they were the breadbasket of Africa when they were Rhodesia. So the Western colonialism was probably the best thing to happen to the world prior to the establishment of the current liberal world order in the wake of World War II. But that's not the narrative that we're espousing here in Canada. It's all bad, all super evil. Shame on you, white guys, Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male. And, it was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males who kicked the Chinese asses in the 1840s wars there that we call the Opium Wars. That's their propaganda. It wasn't about opium. It was about Britain insisting on being treated as an equal power. And by the way, opium was legal, everywhere in the world up until like the 1940s. So in America. Anyway, yeah. And the way that was presented to me when I was in grade 12 was that, and I didn't believe it. I called BS, and we didn't get tested on it. It was just lies my liberal teacher taught me. But it was, they told me that Britain introduced opium to China by force. China's had opium dens since time immemorial. Poppies grow there naturally, like they do everywhere in Eurasia. Of course they had opium. They were also importing opium. And yes, there was some smuggling going on, but it had everything to do with China seeing themselves as the central kingdom and being ethno-supremacists like they are, just mistreating the Brits. They were interning their citizens, and they seized a large cache of goods, which included opium, but then they make it all about the opium and play victim. This is what they always do, those totalitarians. And now we're at a stage here where it's like, yeah, we've been fed their propaganda to demoralize us over the course of generations and make us give up on ourselves, so that we'll basically just kind of collapse on our own.
Yes, that's right. And we have to stop doing that to ourselves. We need to stand up and say, no, Canada is not all bad. We have some problems.
We're the good guys.
Yes, we are.
The best guys. Like, no doubt about it. Head and shoulders above the rest. I mean,
that's why we need to stand up and defend people who can't defend themselves sometimes. It's not, and it's not just whether we should do it, Jeff. I argue that we must do it. We are obligated to do it, specifically the United States, because the United States, after World War II, had nukes. It was a nuclear superpower. Russia got them too, but in order to prevent world catastrophe and nuclear Armageddon, other countries were limited in how much they could have in terms of armaments, right? Ukraine gave up their nukes. They could have been a nuclear power, but they aren't because they gave them up. The United States, after World War II, like it or not, did become the world policeman and a defender of countries that couldn't defend themselves because they were the only country, one of only two countries for a while, that were allowed to have nuclear weapons. As a result, it became an obligation to defend the free world because they were the country that held the power. Yeah. It would be immoral to allow the other nuclear power to just roll over other countries that want freedom, because we are the keepers of freedom, the defenders of freedom. The United States was that shining city on the hill, and it still needs to be, and we need to be part of that. That's why we need to be there. That's why we're obligated to be.
I can't disagree with anything that you're saying there, Rick. As a matter of fact, I make a very similar argument when it comes to Taiwan. It's still just the case, I think, that I'm questioning how we ever got into this position. Like, well, as I've said previously, it kind of seems like Biden was installed to let it happen. And then it was probably China that rigged the election to get him in there, or at least they had a hand in it somehow. And of course, Democrats, like it's a complex kind of combination of factors. There were plenty of just plain old evil leftists in the United States who were involved, like their own public officials, for that matter. Philadelphia, was it? I said Philadelphia. What do I mean to say? Pennsylvania got sued and breaking their own election laws, and
and
polls kept
these
open, all
are
kinds of
just.
stuff,
I mean, we don't know. We'll probably
Yeah.
never know. But at the end of the day, we've got to worry about people who are going through this right now.
Yeah.
This is Ukraine. These are civilians, man. These do not look like military targets to me. Donald Trump said just yesterday that Ukrainian cities are being devastated, like destroyed. Not military targets, cities.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry. Not sorry. We have an obligation. If we just turn our backs on these folks right now, who will trust us when it's our job? It's the job of the United States. And I would put it to you, too, that what Donald Trump has been doing by threatening us and taking us over, that's uncalled for. That's upside down world, too. That makes me wonder about him as much as you're wondering about Biden. And I don't think it's a joke.
I thought it was at first. I don't anymore.
Yeah. And so I worry about it very, very much. I think that guy can go pound salt. He just needs to shut his mouth when it comes to that stuff. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it.
I think I understand what he's doing. Like Canada, we allowed ourselves to become a national security threat to the United States. And, I'm not the one making the case for this. Scott McGregor's a retired Canadian Armed Forces intelligence operator, wrote a book called, with Ina Mitchell, called The Mosaic Effect.
Right.
And it's basically his case that
doesn't justify him taking the country. We can deal with the problem.
What he really wants is a secure border. And that
he's not going to get it by taking us over. It eliminates what he calls an artificial line, which also makes me worried because that's the same kind of rhetoric that we get from Putin talking about Ukraine. It doesn't really exist. We're not a real country. Then I look at all the support that these anti-government, anti-Canadian, sovereign citizen people are getting, and the rhetoric that they spin up. Canada's not a real country. Canada's a myth. The myth is Canada. Canada is just a corporation. It's not a real thing. We don't even have a constitution. Oh yeah, I mean
that stuff. Yeah, I mean, no,
it's all out there.
Making that. I think what I
know you're not making
I thought you were going
to.
No, I'm not making that. Obviously, we're going to stay a sovereign nation, but as far as I'm concerned, but I'm not terribly concerned about any like imminent threat emanating from the United States. And I understand what he's doing. It's like a counter globalist move. Like the fact of the matter is, like, what's he talking about? He's talking about Panama Canal, Greenland, in Canada. Now, Panama Canal. They lost, I don't even know how many Americans building the Panama Canal, but I know that at one point the main export for Panama was human cadavers while they were doing that. So and then it was Carter that we're celebrating here today, who handed the Panama Canal back off to another leftist that we're out there celebrating, and he gave control of the Panama Canal back to Panama. But now you got Donald Trump giving these shout outs to the PLA soldiers who are stationed down there. China has, there's a guy who lives down there who's running around all over South America. Go, look, China. These guys are everywhere. And also, like, the Northwest Passage is open, so we have like Russian and Chinese ships coming through there all the time. Greenland is a good proximity for that. Plus, it's resource rich. So is Canada. And
I get it. I totally get it. But you don't need to take us over. We're already an ally. It's going to be cool, man. Like, settle down. We're like, settle down, Donald. We're gonna take care of it.
And he likes us. He hates our leadership, obviously. And I think that like the rhetoric that I'm seeing coming from, say, like the Cernoviches of the world is that we got to liberate Canada. So I think that there's a lot of it is rhetoric. Donald is probably semi-serious.
Very serious. And he says he doesn't care what Polyev says. He might get elected, might not.
Yeah,
doesn't care.
Serious. You're right.
He's serious. He's serious about this.
I'd rather see stay a sovereign nation, but I don't think I want what's good for Canadians, and what we have right now compared to what we would have if we, we're absorbed by the United States. I think we would be better off with them. I want to stay a sovereign nation and build something even better than the U.S., taking a lot of lessons that I think we should from the United States, but. If we were to wake up tomorrow and we were part of the United States, we would be better off tomorrow than we are today. So I want what's good for Canadians. And I've been making the case that it's let's do Fortress North America, guys. Like, we got to do Fortress North America, take care of ourselves for a little while. We're in a weakened state. So let's do this. We'll make ourselves as prickly as possible so that we're not bothered. This kind of thing. But we would accomplish all of those things if we were to become part of the United States. I think that's a less desirable option, but it's still better than what we have now.
I think there are a lot of things people aren't considering when we talk about that, but I don't want to get too far down that road.
Okay.
It's just a separate subject, really.
Yeah, and
it's just.
I think because I've been in some spaces and stuff like that, there's a real strong kind of anti-American undercurrent in Canadian culture. I think that's the result of a lot of the propaganda of our adversaries. I lived down there for 4 years. They're absolutely wonderful people.
I like the States. Don't get me wrong. I do. I love the States, and I at one time wanted to move to Texas for the weather. And it's because it's a great place, but I love Canada too. And
I've been saying, the thing is, I'm very candid. I'm just like the government of Canada is a proxy for China to use to wage war on us. It seems to be and I know it's not as black and white as that, but our government is captured. If Donald Trump's going to throw his weight around with that government, I'm kind of like, well, it's justified. We're a proxy, for crying out loud. And they have 7 times the number of suspected terrorists crossing into the United States from Canada than they do from Mexico at present. So it's really astounding, what's going on. And I think that it's getting all the wrong kind of attention.
Well, back to Ukraine to kind of try to tie this thing up tonight. I've shown people that Russia lied. I've shown people that Russia is aggressive. I've shown people that they have a new ideology and a geopolitical mandate and objectives, where expansionism and the restoration of imperialism is foundational to their approach to everything. I've shown people that they've committed war crimes and lied about it, that they're just falsehoods all the way along. I've shown people that there is a difference between Ukrainian culture, the Ukrainian experience, Ukrainians and Russians, even though Vladimir Putin says that they're just Russians or Nazis. And that the assertion that Ukrainians are just a bunch of Nazis or nationalists are just a bunch of Nazis is not a black and white issue. That they just really want independence, always did all the way along, and got trapped in a Second World War between 2 very dark and destructive authoritarian ideologies, communism and fascism. And I've shown people that the real existential threat is not only to Ukraine, but to freedom and to the world, because of the emergence of this new, even more dangerous, converged communo-fascistic ideology called fourth political theory. And that's why we need to stand up, because the people of Ukraine are dying. Their culture is threatened, the very existence of it. This is a question of, will Ukraine survive? And for the people who think that this is not our fight, it's already here. We've been talking about it right now. We're talking about the capture of our government by foreign entities, foreign governments that are aligned together to form an axis of resistance, engaged in fifth generation warfare against us right now. And what's going on in Ukraine is just a kinetic portion of that. The kinetic part of it, the bombs and the missiles. And it's Ukrainians who are spilling their blood for all of us. We need to stand up and, at the very least, provide the support that they need over there to fight that portion of the war, and realize that we're under attack here right now ourselves. And that's why we need to support them, because they're supporting us. And all we're giving them is money and maybe some arms, maybe food, maybe some clothing, whatever kind of aid we're sending over, right?
Some GSG 16s. They're doing the gun confiscation, and they're sending our guns to Ukraine because
I know.
Guns are essential for freedom.
Yeah.
So we can't have them.
Right. I know.
Yeah.
I mean,
sorry, the GSG 16 is the 22.
Yeah.
It's like a rim fire, good for cans and squirrels.
Yeah, I get it.
But that's it. And they're going to send that to the Ukrainians. Give me a break.
I know. It's just, it was stupid. Makes me wonder, maybe those are the guys who are working for the Russians. Seriously. I don't know. We've got problems, but we got to work through those problems, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't be supporting people who are in jeopardy. We owe it to them. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to freedom. That's where I'm at with it, man.
I appreciate your position. In fact, I find it to be pretty illuminating. Made some notes. I'm going to look into this guy with the fourth political theory, Dugin.
Yeah. The danger, folks, is if for those of you who do look him up, be very careful, because it's very slick, right? It's mind control shit. It really, truly is, because there's a psychological aspect to this that runs very, very deep, and it actually creates the foundation for the Russian propaganda campaign as well, because the philosophy behind it is deep, and it really challenges the very notion of what reality is.
Yeah.
And much of what we're seeing online right now comes from that. It's challenging our very perception of what is real.
Mm-hmm. Very postmodernist.
Oh, and very dangerous, because it is driving people crazy. We could get into it in a much deeper level. Just that aspect of it, when I'm reading about it, it's mind blowing. It twists your brain around just reading about it.
Yeah.
And then they're employing these tactics against us. Yuri Bezmenov in the 1980s, that was nothing. That was like that's like a typewriter. This is artificial intelligence, generationally leaping forward in the way that they're screwing with your mind.
Yep.
So
I think Derrida is who I'm thinking of here. He was one of the postmodernists. He taught in American schools, for crying out loud. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it's very much in line with a lot of his just skullduggery.
And you know how Dugin pulls people in? He does it with interviews and in speeches where all he really does publicly is criticize the West and hit on the hot button issues that get people really upset. The sexual politics, all the progressive issues, to get people on the right-hand side of the political spectrum really fired up. And that's how he pulls people in. And once you're in there, later you learn about these other, you become indoctrinated into it, right? But it's those emotional issues that pull you in. And he doesn't tell you, like any good authoritarian, he's deceptive, because he doesn't tell you what he stands for. He tells you what he's standing against, what he's upset about.
And that is a great way to know when you're being propagandized. Is what it does is it always appeals to your emotions. It always manipulates your emotions. That's how you get manipulated. It's by your emotions, not your intellect.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're paying attention, well, the purpose of the TV is to tell you who to hate. I think that's pretty clear to most of your audience there, Rick. But yeah, propaganda is something that appeals to you. And shame is like probably the most effective tool that they use. We can see that like with the Maoist struggle sessions that we all have to do now at Remembrance Day over our colonialist past, this kind of thing. So, and when people are in that depressed state, they're more malleable, especially because you're in a depressed state. Your emotions are so raw. Everything, your skin is paper thin, and so they just keep rubbing that raw, and that's how you get manipulated. Tries you to do stupid things on their behalf.
And just to kind of, since we're near the end of this, I better give Zelensky at least an opportunity to say something here. And this is from the Lex Fridman interview that, it's getting a lot of traction. And I think that the way he approached it, he did ask some tough questions. This was a much better interview than what Tucker Carlson did with Putin, I think. A little more balanced.
You have to look at him as a serious person who loves his country and loves the people in his country. And he conducts, yes, destructive military actions.
Who are you talking about now? Who loves his country?
Putin. Do you think he doesn't love his country?
No. What is his country? He happened to consider Ukraine his country. What is his country? Explain it. Tomorrow he will say that it's America. No pity for the Chechens? Do they look like Russians? Do they speak Russian? Of course. Of course they learn in schools like anywhere there's been Russification. Who are the Chechens? A different people. Another faith, other people, another language, a million. Eliminated. And eliminated how? How did he kill them? With love? I know, fuck. By hugging. In Ukrainian, as we say, strangling by hugging. I love you so much. I love you so much that I want to kill you. That's his love. And that's not love. You're mistaken. He does not love his people. He loves his inner circle. It's only a small part of the people. He doesn't love them. Why? I'll explain. You cannot send your people to another land to die, knowing that they will die. Children, my daughter, she is 20 years old. For me, this is a child. She is already an adult, of course. But she is a child. The boys he sends are 18 years old. 18 years old. They are children. He sends them. It's not that fascists came to his land and he needs to defend it. He came to ours and he sent them. Chechnya, he sent them. Syria, he sent them. Africa, he sent them. Georgia, he sent them. Moldova, Transnistria, that was before him. Fine, we can leave that aside. He has enough sins of his own. And then there's Ukraine, the largest part. 780,000. 788,000 killed or wounded Russians. He calls them all Russians, even those who don't know how to speak Russian. On his territory of Russia, everything they've enslaved. Yes, proud Varangians. So I wonder, is that love? What love is this? And for what?
That makes a good case.
Yeah, I encourage everybody to at least go watch it. Don't just Just don't watch the sound bites, the 10-second clips. Don't just base your judgment on the video of Volodymyr Zelensky dancing in high heels and a sequined unitard or whatever it was he was wearing when he was, and he's an actor, right? I mean, I get it, but here's the thing. Robin Williams dressed up to play Mrs. Doubtfire, and we don't demonize him. He's an actor, plays roles. You may not agree with the lifestyle of certain people. I mocked him myself on this very program. We ran those videos and I laughed. And they are funny. But there are more serious things to deal with. And we owe it to ourselves, to the world, to try and look at this through a serious lens. I'll give the final thought to you tonight, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Rick. Yeah, I do appreciate the education on a lot of this because, like I said, I just kind of put it aside and said it was a corrupt war, shouldn't have happened. I don't know that I moved much on some of those sort of key elements of it, but certainly, yeah, I agree that Ukraine should continue to be a country. And that Russia, like I know Russia are not the good guys. Russia are absolutely bad guys. They're like the world's bad guys, maybe overtaken by the Chinese now. I think so, yes. But yeah, they've always been expansionist. It's just that I thought we could have done a better job containing that. And yeah, like I said, I think if we manage to contain them and contain China, and it's necessary. I recognize that as well. Like you said, they're waging war on us, so we have to counter that somehow. And if we don't fight them over there, then we're going to fight them here. Our ancestors said it. I know it. I know it now. It didn't make sense to me when I was a kid, but certainly it does now. And I think that the case that you laid out here tonight just illustrates why. It's like I said, most of the world, they're still stuck on that default setting, slave master species. And, the savages tear down the civilized. That's kind of the story of the rise and fall of civilizations, or at least one part of it. The barbarians never sacked a Roman city. It was always the case that the gates were held open for them. So that's where we are now.
All right. Jeff, thank you for joining us on the program again tonight. I really appreciate it. And I think it's been a great conversation. And folks, I hope you all found value in what we presented tonight. And there will be more tomorrow night as our quest to, save freedom continues at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'll see you tomorrow on the flip side.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.